All right, welcome to the May 7th LTS working group meeting. We have a pretty short agenda, but we will go ahead and get started. Mo, you are up with some notes about the KubeCon EU Contributor Summit.
Yeah. Are you sharing your screen, Jordan?
Oh, no, I'm not. That would be helpful, wouldn't it? Give me a second.
Yeah, so while Jordan gets that pulled up, so we met at KubeCon EU and had a nice discussion around LTS, which we briefly brought up a couple of meetings back. So in the doc there, at the top is the link to the actual recording. If anyone wants to go just listen. I have condensed that hour into some text for folks if folks just want to read it. Um, Certainly, if anyone has any just direct feedback, certainly you can leave it in the doc or something. We can talk about it maybe in a future meeting or whatever, since I know that I haven't shared this doc before. Um, but sort of below my hand transcription is just sort of my take on the highlights of the hour or so of things that came up. Um, uh, I guess before we go to that, does anyone have any questions or anything specific? Also, if y'all want to take like 5 minutes of quiet time and just read it,
Yeah.
that's totally fine.
I love that we have the philosophical discussion. What is LTS? It's like, well, it is actually a really big topic.
Yeah, how long and what is it? And that's not a new question. Like 14 months ago, those were the two questions we were asking. How long and what is it?
Actually, in the interest of making this meeting/recording even a tiny bit watchable for people who enjoy the video later, Mo, do you want to give us the cliff notes as we go? Like, you started the discussion, started with the what is, what's is not long enough, Go versions, REST APIs. There's, of course, challenges. And we kind of went right into what is LTS. Would you say there was a lot of disagreement about what LTS is, or?
Um, I think I think the biggest open question there would be that um, if you decide that LTS includes anything but security fixes, I think people's definition of like what's a critical fix is ambiguous. What is critical to me? Like, for example, I run a lot of Windows nodes, so I might consider even minor Windows bugs to be a big problem. But if you don't use Windows at all, you might not care. And you're like, why are you messing with the kubelet and possibly causing a regression on my non-Windows code, right? So I think that's certainly there. I suspect the easiest answer there is, well, it's only security fixes. And if you want anything else, you get to figure that out. But from a community perspective, we won't try to guess what you want. That might not end up being maybe popular, but I do think it's certainly the easiest answer there. Right? Like if you can point to a CVE, uh, then we're not picking favorites. We're saying that we we as the community slash we Kubernetes Security Response Committee decided that this was a security issue and therefore it meets the qualification of whatever LTS meets. Not the best, I guess, but it is okay, I guess. The reason I think I feel kind of okay with that because it is totally possible in the future to expand what's included, but to take it away is, I think, effectively impossible. So
Yeah. And
let's
there is a CVE is very unambiguous. Like there is a CVE or there's not a CVE. Like that's a pretty clear line.
yeah. It's also that means there's not going to be that many things because we don't have that many CVEs.
Not directly in Cube, but like transitively to
Yeah.
Go versions and things like that, and dependencies. I mean, it's still not a ton, but it's a much steadier stream once you include like dependencies.
Yeah. The other aspect of like LTS was, like it's, hey, it has to be longer, and but what does that? The longer part, I think, comes down to, well, what happens at the end of your longer period, right? And that opens up the important discussion about upgrades and compatibility versions, basically, right? Like, or anything really related to upgrades. So like testing around upgrades, or more importantly, our complete lack thereof of testing around upgrades. I think we very heavily rely on the vendors to do a lot of upgrade testing. In a sense, I don't feel bad about that, about like vendors having to do a bunch of work. I do wish we had better checks in place in upstream to catch things before the vendors had to catch them for us. Because I know Red Hat has OpenShift has really good upgrade tests. I know AKS does a ton of regression tests before we release a new version. I'm willing to bet EKS and GKE do the same, because it's sort of like business critical work.
Right.
It would be really nice if some aspects of that existed in upstream, at least, just to give us a good sense of what's going on. One of the other things that I know Antonio had brought up is that we not only don't we have upgrade tests, we also don't necessarily have tests of feature interaction, like the intersection of new features when enabled together or in certain states. That one seems like a really hard problem for us to work on, because like I don't even know, other than turning on all features and then running all of their tests at once and seeing what happens. I'm not really sure what to do there, but it is, I
That's
think,
actually terrifying. That's terrifying because it's not just turn on all features. This is like a feature matrix with like infinity testing.
Yeah. So I mean, there are a few things in that direction, like the alpha EDE job, which is like actually turn on all the alpha APIs and turn on all the alpha features, and like, is the cluster healthy? Like, are the specific tests for the specific alpha features still working? Like, it's not exhaustive in any way, but
yeah.
the goal of things like that, and people kind of complain about that. They're like, oh, it's sometimes red, it's usually red. Like, why do we even have this? Like, because it should be possible to start a cluster with the features we say we're working on that we're going to graduate. Like, if that's not even possible, we really need to know that. So that there are some aspects of that. We also lean heavily on people working on features, people owning areas to say like this and that are going to interact. So we need to test specifically for that interaction. But it's manual, it's best effort, it relies on humans catching things. Yeah, systematically exercising the matrix, I don't think would be possible like before the heat death of the universe.
Well, and Rob also points out, as we see in the notes here, like even just something like gateway API and all of the permutations. Because we're not even just talking cube, we're talking about like the ecosystem and all of the ways it can change.
Yeah. So this statement, Mo, like LTS brings value without cost. Was that like a perspective thing, or is that like a statement of fact? Because I can see that perspective, but I disagree with it as a statement of fact.
Yeah. So what I was trying to say there is basically, if you are a user
Uh-huh.
Of Kubernetes, and now suddenly, say instead of 1 year of support, you got 2 years of support, and I don't even remember the numbers exactly, right? You just get to keep running Cube at some older version for longer and sort of be in this happy state, right? Like, imagine you were using beta APIs. Well, obviously within a particular point release of Cube, the beta API is not going to go anywhere, right? So like, it allows you to maybe coast in certain ways that you couldn't without like a specific cost.
Yeah, so if
Hold on, let me finish.
okay.
The reason I said it that way, because it was meant to mostly highlight that the cost is asymmetric. Like using an LTS versus having to maintain everything necessary to have LTS, both within Cube and our larger ecosystem, I think the cost has shifted away from the people that benefit. Does that make sense? Like I don't have to make Gateway API support 15 releases just because LTS exists now, right? I could just use Gateway API and I don't have to pay anyone anything for it.
So one of two things is going to happen. Either Gateway API will not use things that would make your life better, like they'll keep running webhooks when they could use cell validation because they're still supporting like old versions. So like there is a cost there. Or they'll just be like, you know what, we're not going to support that LTS version. You can stick on that 2-year-old version, but we're not going to support it anymore. And so then you're kind of hung out to dry because it's like, I'm using Gateway API, but I actually don't have like patched versions of that anymore. And so I think the costs are there. They're just like second order costs that are not the obvious, like, don't take away my mid API. Let me keep everything as it is for another year. It's like actually keeping everything exactly as it is. Like you're going to be vulnerable to stuff. Like you don't want to keep everything as it is. You want to stay supported non-disruptively.
Yeah, I feel like we need a set of words to describe what you just said in like a sentence, like because there like I fully agree with you, by the way. I have no disagreement there. I have a hard time turning that into a simple sentence I could tell to someone, just like, hey, you like I feel like I'm guilty of this too, right? Like whenever I run any dev box on Linux, I will 100% use the LTS release because I'm like, I don't, this is not my job. The running the stupid Linux machine is not my job. So I just need it to be as stable as possible. I guess
maybe it's the distinction between like, are you only depending on core Kubernetes components and like nothing else from the ecosystem, and everything running on your cluster is your code that you control and are responsible for? If that's the case, then yeah, core components giving you another 10 months of security patches is strictly better for you. But I don't think anyone runs clusters that way. I think everyone is using maybe a few things, maybe a lot of things from the ecosystem. And so for all of those people, just extending the lifetime of the core components doesn't actually solve their problem, and actually will either mean the ecosystem things they're using will drop support, or like slow down and stop improving as quickly in order to accommodate supporting more older miners and not use new features. So again, I don't know how to put that into a single sentence. That's not pithy. Anyway, to me, that's like aside from like the cost to the Kubernetes project of, can we afford to do this? Do we have the people and time? And like, can we afford to extend this? Do we need to do it? Are people actually blocked on old miners? That aspect of, will this grind the ecosystem to a halt? Because people, it's like it becomes like a 2-year lag between improvement goes into CRDs and anyone in the ecosystem starts to take advantage of it broadly, because they're wanting to support everything Cube supports, and we would then have 2-year-old versions. That's the core question for me, and that, I think Rob brought that out. Like,
do we feel like it's easier for ecosystem projects to support like skip level upgrades than it is core Cube?
I don't know what that means. What do you
I
mean?
think so. If my understanding of Scott's question is, so today in Cube, control planes don't support skip upgrades, but kubelets do.
Mhm.
In other projects that have various components, say as a for example, I'll use the auth stack I worked on at VMware, right? Like Pinniped. You could go from like version 1 to version 10 and it'll be fine. Like
Yeah.
it'll
It's the same with our logging stack. Like you can just skip 3 versions and never even think about it.
Yeah, like basically the way we had written our internals and our storage was like, if you encounter something too old, it's fine. We've built with everything effectively being ephemeral. It's just move on. Like you don't have to freak out.
Would that we could make cube that way.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on how the project is structured. So
Yeah.
I think Gateway API tries to, I should be careful speaking for Gateway API. I think they try to like maintain like a single version at head, which supports
5 cube releases.
all the Kubernetes miners they support, rather than having like minor releases and patches on minor releases and maintaining multiple parallel minor
Yeah.
patch release streams.
So I do think Scott's bringing up a good point, right? For us, this is a really significant pain point. Right? Like even with kubelets being able to skip 3 versions, you still got to drain your kubelets, right? And that's where all the risk for like workloads and everything comes into play. Because you don't look like you agree, Jordan. I'm curious which part of that.
Upgrading nodes, draining, like I don't think it's the drain and recreate. That's pretty standard. That in many cloud providers, that happens even on patch upgrades. Like that's not where I see the pain happening. I see the pain happening at like minor control plane boundaries, which is where a lot of cluster-wide things tend to get coupled. In my observation, it's not even so much the Kubernetes minor change anymore. Like since Beta API stopped going away, like on the Kubernetes side, the minor version bump is not usually that noticeable or that impactful. Like we'll get a bug or a regression here or there and we'll fix it. But a lot of things around the cluster like couple to the minor boundary. And so it's like, oh, we went from Kubernetes 127 to 128. And also these other 5 cluster-wide components changed because the minor version was like a convenient place to tie version bumps of other stuff.
Yep.
And
I think I'm struggling. Are you just saying it's not that the control plane upgraded, it's just that a bunch of things upgraded right around the same time? Is that?
yeah.
Okay.
And so I don't think it's the nodes draining and getting recreated. I don't think it's almost ever the node versions themselves changing. I think it's the control plane and the stuff versioned with the cluster. The Kubernetes minor version has just become a convenient place to hang like a lot of other stuff changed too.
I see.
Yeah, I agree. But I was just trying to think through like not terribly familiar with Gateway API, but if these ecosystem projects, if it's easy for them to sort of ship sparse versions and they could do, I don't know if they ship generally on the same release cadence as Cube, but if they do, like ship 3 times a year and then every 3rd version or something like that and you can skip and it supports a broad version of Cube releases, like does that, I'm wondering if it's easier for the ecosystem to react to us than maybe we're thinking it is. Just based on, like Mo said with their auth stack, it was sort of in our logging stack in OpenShift. It's pretty trivial for anyone to bump 3 versions in those things, but I don't know if that's unique.
Let me take an action item and ask Rob, at least specifically for like Gateway API, because that's an interesting project because it's not only just a set of CRDs, but also a set of implementations. I would be very curious what their recommendations around upgrades are. right? Because if they support the last 5 versions, but then you can skip a bunch of their versions when you upgrade, like I'm just curious. I guess I've never asked Rob this, so
It might be worth asking several of the sort of in project, but out of tree things. So like Gateway API, maybe CSI folks, because they have a similar thing. Like they have a sidecar they maintain that depends on some set of Kubernetes APIs. And then they have a lot of providers that they integrate with.
Which CSI thing are you referring to, George?
CSI sidecar. Let's see if I can.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of things even further than from Kubernetes, but that like support versions of Kubernetes, like Helm just has a blanket, supports the last, like their 3.14 release supports Kubernetes 1.29 down through 1.26. So I imagine there are a bunch of projects that kind of just say like, we have a moving window and this is what we're targeting.
I'm wondering
As
then, like, can you go from Helm 3.11 directly to whatever 3.13, 3.14? That basically the bookends of those 2 versions align such that you end up supporting all the versions. Yeah.
Yes, those upgrades are entirely feasible. Like inside a supported Kubernetes version for sure, even larger jumps possibly, but
yeah, just as a random other anecdote, right? So the same auth stack I was referring to, it to this day still supports Kubernetes 121 all the way to the head of KK. That's what tests in its CI. Just because it's just easier to just support all of it.
This was the CSI. There's a whole set of containers that they provide that external CSI plugins can integrate with. So this is what like interfaces between the Kubernetes APIs and the gRPC endpoints that providers expose. So it looks like they release like with the Kubernetes cadence. Sounds like they support a little bit of skew, like in at least in one version either way. I think this, if I recall correctly, this was like what do we have to have in order to allow upgrades? And so that's what they promise. I don't know if generally it would work beyond that, but then like when there's a API transition from like CSI driver beta to V1, like I don't know how long they keep support for the beta API, for example.
So I know we've digressed a bit, but basically back to the notes from the working group discussion. Yes, the ecosystem, there's a lot there. Back to you, Mo.
Yes. So let's see. What was the next things in my little summary?
Oh, I guess we could go to Mo's summary now that we've all had a chance to kind of glance through the whole document. Just keep scrolling down. It's a little
Oh,
further.
did you have a summary at the bottom? Oh, you had a summary
He
at the bottom.
did.
Sorry, I hadn't even made it to the
Yeah.
bottom.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think maybe the third bullet point might be something to discuss, right? And it's just basically who pays for all this. I think that was a big topic. But there's just the really obvious cost of like, well, we have to run more infra probably, actually almost certainly to support some kind of LTS. Well, who's going to pay for this? So I don't have any answers there, but certainly it sounds like something we should be able to get support from the various vendors to give us compute resources for this. That's, I think, the easy part. The harder part is, well, some human being that understands how that old infra works needs to be present to keep it from melting.
Like I remain hung up on, is this a good thing to do? Like, I understand there's some demand for it. There's some support for it, like by providers, where there's a much more direct relationship between there's demand that translates into paying for it, that translates into providing that service. in general, I don't think that the fragmentation and like calcification, if I can use that word, is a good thing. And I think that is the biggest risk. Like, can we pay for it? Can we sustain it? Like, those are very tactical, practical questions. They're good questions we have to answer, but like the strategic, the philosophical questions, will we grind the project to a halt and make it so expensive for every ecosystem project to actually sort of expand their support the same way Kubernetes core is proposing expanding it? Like, I'm very worried about that.
Yeah, our experience as we have expanded the OpenShift lifecycle is that everyone just expands to fill the vacuum, and in their use, like they just go to the oldest version, and I think that is detrimental to a project that wants to move forward.
When you say expand their use, do you just mean, I guess, can you describe that so I understand exactly what you meant?
Pick on the oldest version possible.
Yeah, the
No matter what.
majority of our customers are on the oldest supported version today.
Yeah, I guess OpenShift has the harder part that you guys don't force upgrades.
Right.
Which,
Now,
I mean,
no, go ahead. I've talked enough.
yeah, I guess, like, in my head, like, I look at, so we support 14 months per release, right? I'm remembering that number, right? Because it's
Yep.
it's
It's
an
a year plus a couple months to overlap, so you can actually upgrade to the
Okay,
new
I was
number.
like, where did we get the 14 number from? Why is it not a year?
We started with a year, and then we're like, oh yeah, people don't upgrade in the 1 second after the release is cut, so we need a couple months overlap.
Okay, fine, that's fair. It's totally fair.
Side note, I love the part where you think it only takes a couple months. I mean, love the part where we think it only takes people a couple months to do anything because lol, but you know.
Yeah, I guess to me, like the issue with that whole year bucket is I don't think for most of the customers I've ever interacted with that Cube itself is actually like a significant part of like what they want to accomplish. So having to mess with Cube every year is a significant burden.
So if you're not doing anything with Cube, then you're not getting security fixes. Like, you're insecure. You're not getting patch builds. You're not getting bug fixes and security fixes. Like, we have to assume that reasonable customers have a process for absorbing like non-disruptive safe changes.
Sure.
Like, so don't touch it at all. I don't think is a reasonable position for anybody. And I'm not happy like enabling that.
Yeah, I don't mean that. I mean like you're perfectly fine
Anything that's
staying within a point
disruptive,
release.
I agree with. So looking at the things about our minor versions that have been disruptive and eliminating those, I am totally on board with. So don't expose unstable things by default. Don't give them APIs that are going to turn off. Don't break compatibility with stable API services and stable features. The 130 release was the first minor version since I think 122 that didn't have like urgent upgrade notes, because there weren't any, because we didn't knowingly make action required items that people just had to read the release notes or they would break. Like, all of those are good things. I think we are getting to the point where the minor version update of Kubernetes is not actually the disruptive thing. It's all the other things in your cluster that you have decided, oh, a minor version is a convenient time to like bundle a bunch of change. And I think that is what is becoming the predominant thing that's disruptive. And that's not going to be solved by patching a given minor version of Cube for another 10 months. Like, the people running the cluster and bundling stuff along with the minor version, like the ethos of don't break stuff on minor upgrades has to expand to the other stuff running in your cluster that you're updating with the minor version.
I mean, I guess you don't have to, right? Like,
Yeah, you don't have to. And people who don't change a bunch of other stuff at the minor upgrade, I haven't seen evidence of a lot of disruption coming from Kubernetes minor upgrades.
right.
Like,
So then wouldn't it be okay to then even further reduce your risk by just staying on the same minor cube version that's being patched for longer?
no. Like, improvements and new capabilities without disruption is the goal. And I think we're making
So
good
hold on,
strides.
I disagree
Go
with
ahead.
that, right? That's not what LTS means to like me. I don't want improvements. I just don't want change. I don't need anything to change. I just want the security fixes. Like that's why, like for example, when I use an LTS Ubuntu box, it's because I don't care about any improvements. I just don't want it to have CVEs, and I want it to keep working so I can keep doing my job. Because I have never used any bleeding edge kernel feature. I don't even know what they are.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's
And
what
you
I
probably
keep.
don't want them. You actively do not want the kernel to do exciting new things. You want to do the
Because
exact
that's
things
why
it was
people
already
screw stuff
doing.
up. Like
But that's
humans
not
wrote
just,
that C code.
and that's the way you feel about it. And that's also in some of these enterprises, they got version, 1.27 certified, and they went through a huge amount of pain to get somebody to bless it. And if you're moving any of their cheese, suddenly like they're not certified anymore, or they don't have the stamp of approval that this definitely all got checked and vetted and thumbs up by someone. Like that's the place where when we start saying like, we'll only patch certain security things. And I'm like, okay, as long as we still call it the exact same version, they might still be able to say this is still the thing that we got an okay on. And if it's not the same anymore, if it has a different number on it, people will suddenly be like, oh, you have to start the certification process again. And somebody's like, okay, we're not doing this upgrade because we can't face the 8 months of that.
I mean, but even if you ignore certification, right? Like, why would I introduce change into a system when the change doesn't benefit me? Like, it's one thing if I want to use the feature or have anybody in my environment that wants to use the feature. But if my explicit goal was to just limit change to the environment basically to the minimum, which is security fixes or catastrophic other fixes, maybe. Even that, I could say, like, maybe just don't touch the part of the stack that's broken. Just don't use that functionality if it causes corruption instead of trying to fix it, right? Like that's what LTS is to me as a user of LTS products, right? It's just I don't because the thing that I'm using has been good enough for so long that none of the features matter. Right. And I also look at Cube that way. Like the CRE features, amazing. Never feel any need to use them because I'm just like, I'm just going to encode all the logic into my controller for every validation anyway, because then it will work on every Cube version and then I'm done. Right. Like that's what I have done in the, like that is the reason the VMware Outstack supports 10 releases of Cube, because it doesn't use any of those features and is totally fine. Which sucks. I'm sorry that I don't use any of the new stuff, but not using the new stuff makes it so the thing is ultra stable and basically never breaks.
Yeah. Is it possible to build projects that way? Yes, absolutely. We have existence proofs of it. Do most projects build things that way? Absolutely not. So, like, yeah,
Yeah. And the funny thing is it still bumps to the latest Cube libraries, right? It's just that we have proof that its entire feature set works because of its E2E coverage against.
Yeah.
But again, it also works because it's a smaller problem, right? Like it is a targeted specific problem, and therefore you can define complete end-to-end suites that test its feature set. Trying to do anything like that with Cube is just a completely different problem altogether. Never mind that that project has been maintained by like 5 people over its life. So there is like a very small set of humans you have to ask, like, hey, did we cover everything?
But
Mo,
you do make an important point about the testing though. And I think that is your key. It's like Antonio says, test, test, test. That's how we get safe.
with your Linux DevBox example, like what do you do at the end of that LTS release? I assume you upgrade in place, or do you just throw it out?
I upgrade in place.
Okay, and then you do that.
That,
Like, how often do
hold
you
on,
have to do
asterisk
that?
first. I do have automatic backup with snapshots set on my dev VM, so that way if I manage to blow it up, I can restore it back to a functioning point. But yes, then I do a in-place LTS upgrade to the latest LTS to then not have to mess with that for another N years. Because it is like disruptive to my like, but I'm unwilling to let it go unsupported, right? Like I'm unwilling to let my dev box basically
Yeah.
turn into a security risk to me and my employer. So I do actually do that piece. I understand some people basically just leave it and just kind of YOLO it. That's not me.
I'm just trying to think through like what enables that to be successful for you, but I don't think it's any different from the things that we've talked about, like
So
as
I think
skip
probably the
level
biggest thing is
updates.
I don't mess with the config of that box much, right? It's mostly like most of the state of my dev VM is in my home directory, right? So it's basically configurations that like my stuff is using, but I don't mess with the OS's config. I don't go tweak it. I don't futz with it. So like the
And
parts
you
that
don't depend on lots of other like sort of esoteric things that would drive requirements for
yeah,
newer
usually
strength.
during an LTS upgrade, it'll be like, hey, these things changed. Do you want to take the new stuff? I'm like, yeah, just do the thing that you think is correct LTS upgrade because I haven't touched any of those. If you think I touched them, you were wrong. I didn't do it. It was some random process. So you can fix
Right.
it.
So I would analogize your use of LTS OSs to someone who only uses core Kubernetes components and basically doesn't take advantage of any interesting features of Kube. They're like pods, config maps, secrets, deployments, done. Like
Or the Go toolchain that you use supports a broad skew of Linux OSs, or whatever tools you're using on that supports skew such that that doesn't matter.
yeah, and that just doesn't match how I see most people running clusters. Like most people running clusters are pulling in lots of other components outside their control that have a mix of like what Cube features they make use of and test with and support. And so like I don't think your LTSOS strategy would work if you depended on lots of sort of newer applications and libraries and components that are like, nope, I need this kernel thing. I need that kernel thing. I need this thing that just showed up a year ago in, Ubuntu releases or whatever OSUs. Yeah.
I think the other part is though, like whenever I do encounter something that wants a bunch of stuff, I'll try to see if they have a Docker version of it so I don't actually have to futz with my machine. I can basically virtualize all their dependencies into a container and it lives in there. I don't know if I don't know if I have an analogy for that in Cube. I guess in a sense, like I know from like a customer perspective, like for our LTS, right? Our recommendation would be is like run your boring workloads on this environment, right? Like run the stuff that isn't trying to be Cube friendly. It's just your old stuff that you moved to Cube because you wanted to have some of the feature set of Cube, but you like, so don't go calling Kubernetes REST APIs because that's not the point of this environment. Right? Like it's just an orchestration platform. It's not like your new fun data store that you're gonna start having fun with CRDs.
Okay.
Let's see.
So let's see, we've kind of gone through a lot of the stuff in your summary. In the minute we have left, Mo, do you want to kind of tell us what you think comes next?
So I think on the one thing I had said on that, I think that same question is I'm personally interested in like better upgrade tests and what is our path to skip version upgrades on control planes, like if that's compatibility versions or something like compatibility versions. I'd be really interested in those conversations. Yeah, I don't know if like I think so Jordan, you weren't there at Scott, were you there at KubeCon? I can't remember.
Not this one.
Not that one. Yeah, so I think Bridget, you had asked this question, like where do you see things going? So I don't know, I guess I would maybe ask it to you guys, like Jordan, Scott, like where you guys sort of.
I think the focusing on gaps we have today in the support we already have today, like upgrade testing, SKU testing, multi-server upgrade testing. Like, those are gaps we have today that are like a necessary piece of anything we're going to do with better upgrade stories around LTS specific stuff. The skip upgrade or compatibility or like whatever that is, I agree with that. Leaving branches in a state that could be supported longer outside the project. So leaving them at the end of their current life in open source on a current Go version with really clear patch sets for if you want to bump to the next Go version, here's what you need. Next version, here's what you need. Next version, here's what you need. Continuing the push to make the Kubernetes minor versions basically action required free. That was a really awkward way to say that. No action required. There we go. Like those are all things that I think we should do. We should have been doing. We should continue to press on. I think the next step out where I would focus is expanding those approaches to ecosystem projects. Like things around Cube should be doing testing, should be like not requiring action on upgrade, so that even if you're bundling some of those things into your minor version updates, it can be equally low risk.
Yeah, I agree overall, like reducing the cognitive load of applying an update is sort of the key thing here. I am curious about like what sort of upgrade testing we want and what the gaps are. I don't know what we have today.
I'd be happy to any upgrade testing.
Yeah, like we spend an incredible amount of time monitoring for disruption and things like that during upgrades, but that's not like, did the upgrade work or not?
Yeah, I think Mo was correct. Like a lot of providers have their own upgrade testing, but that is like months after changes have made it into open source that surfaces as a problem.
Yeah, it's
So,
basically like, when 130 came out, we had to certify it, right? So that the certification process for us is like, all right, cool. Like we have a bunch of stuff we run on Cube. We'll add all that to a 129, and then we'll upgrade to what we think our 130 should look like with whatever configs we have. And does it still work? Like, does our QA check still pass? And almost certainly it won't. Something will break somewhere. Usually it's our fault, right? It's usually not like Cube's fault. It's like we screwed it up somehow. But
that's what I was gonna say is like, it's the things that we find they're not cube problems. I think there have been a few with like service load balancers, but it's all the other stuff that is surrounding cube that is the challenge. HA proxy tightened some RFC rules. So now if you specify a header twice, connections get reset, stuff like that, that is so far removed from cube that, you know.
Like a key question I would have for like providers who are wanting this is, could you achieve basically the stability you want by not changing any of the stuff around cube? Like, is Kubernetes reaching the point? Could we make it reach the point where the minor update of Kubernetes would actually not be disruptive if you held all the other possibly problematic things the same? What would that look like? We are over time, so I think we should wrap it up. But yeah, I don't know that there are new questions, but maybe there are more specific versions of those questions to ask. All right, thank you all. Talk online. See you.
Well,
Thanks.
maybe.